Like any new technology, it can be very disruptive. Law by nature is not disruptive, it can be very conservative. So there's always been a struggle with the explosion of cloud computing in the last 2 or 3 years. It has thrown up a lot of legal issues, some of which I'm going to mention here. Of course, it should be noted that, as you all know, cloud computing has been around for some time under different guises and names, such as ASP computing. So as lawyers, we are familiar. It wasn't as if we had to dust all this off and learn it 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, we've been doing ASP services agreements and similar type service and license agreements for many years. But the initial issues, some of which do remain and which have been articulated, I'm calling this Cloud Law 1.0, have been that the challenges, if you like, were that with the chain of providers in the cloud, that often there has not been a contractual link between the end user and the back-end suppliers. So if something goes wrong for the end user in terms of the service they're purchasing from the cloud, the person who actually made the mistake may not be contractually linked because there may be a couple of intermediaries between. So that lack of a contractual nexus has presented problems. Another problem which we've underlined has been that, especially with early cloud applications, and it continues to be the case today, certain providers, and especially with freeware, a lot of cloud services have been made available on an as-is basis. That means that, for example, a service may be made available for free to users, whether corporate users or consumer users. But obviously, if something is being made available for free, it's not being coupled with a lot of undertakings and warranties, and therefore we call the contract an as-is contract. A bit like the old-fashioned principle of caveat emptor. You buy your house as it is. If there's problems, it's your fault. Your engineer should have looked at it. So, but from a legal purchaser's perspective, that has thrown up problems because they're using services. They're not being coupled with any legal obligations if the services go wrong. So that has been a source of concern. Data protection and data security has been and continues to be one of the key issues of concern in the cloud. So we've underlined that in the past, and I'm going to look at where we are today on that. Another issue of concern, both legal and practical, is the international nature of the cloud and the multiple legal jurisdictions involved. While the whole idea of the cloud is that it's globally dynamic and large amounts of data can be moved around the world very, very dynamically and efficiently, that doesn't sit well with law, which is jurisdictional by nature. So that again has been an issue, and we're going to look at how some of the changes have affected that. So as I said, despite these legal challenges, which if you like, we've been articulating for some time, the cloud itself has done quite well and continues to evolve and explode in terms of the offerings. So just, I guess, as an endorsement of the cloud success, one simply has to look at the World Economic Forum, which is sort of an annual meeting of global leaders, both business and country leaders, where they meet in Davos every year for a nice weekend in Switzerland. But invariably, they tend to issue a couple of key papers, and in conjunction with Accenture, they published recently a paper whereby they explored the future of cloud computing. And what they did was quite interesting, is that they recognize what we already know, which is the key benefits of cloud computing, namely scalability, elasticity, reduced costs. But they were very quick to point out and recognize that these are clear benefits to business, but this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the delivery the delivery abilities of the cloud. And they went on to recognize that the second wave of cloud computing is arriving, and it set out some of the key advantages of the next wave as the cloud becomes even more sophisticated in terms of what it can provide. And they particularly zoned in on some key issues. It's quite an interesting paper, such as the ease in which collaboration can occur globally using cloud-based solutions. Interestingly, they pointed out how small players, even startups, can compete with very large players because they can buy very large computer processing power and computer services, both infrastructure and software services. And very interestingly, they also looked at small economies, especially in the developing world, and they pointed out that, like late starters in the Industrial Revolution, they are now no longer constrained by technology as a barrier to entry, because with low-cost cloud services, they can really leapfrog, and in fact, they get over a lot of the legacy systems which large developed economies are presented. So I guess what's salutary about the World Economic Forum is that when you have one of the most famous international think tanks and gatherings of business leaders and country leaders, and it turns out they're spending their weekend or part of their weekend talking about cloud computing, it's no longer sort of a backroom techie thing. This is real and tangible. So parking that for a moment, I guess that's the context in which I want to look at some of these developments. But the traditional uses of the cloud, and we're all familiar, and these continue to be the principal uses is infrastructure as a service, cloud-based storage, cloud-based software and supply of software through the cloud. We're not quite there at utility computing yet in a number of respects, but there is a great deal of software. More and more software is being delivered from the cloud. But just looking what they said at the World Economic Forum in terms of the next wave of the cloud, one doesn't have to look abroad for examples of that. Just a client of mine, GS1 Ireland, recently unveiled two very interesting cloud-based products. GS1 are the barcode people that are responsible for barcodes throughout the grocery chain, and also to a lesser extent in the healthcare and pharma chain. And they've launched two very interesting products. One, datasync.ie, has been currently launched, whereby basically it's a global data pool for the grocery industry, whereby all manufacturers, suppliers, purchasers can input data and track data, and basically whereby the entire global supply chain is moved onto the cloud and accessible. So a manufacturer can really quickly change details about stock it has in the system, and that information can be accessed by purchasers, both the large multiples and the small purchasers throughout Ireland and throughout the world. So a very sophisticated cloud-based service which has been developed and driven by an Irish company. Similarly, GS1 have also launched a very interesting solution in terms of tracking medication, whereby essentially certain key medicines, life-saving medicines, are the details of which from the moment they leave the factory are placed in a cloud-based data center. So when the patient receives these critical goods, they're able to pull out their smartphone, scan the barcode, and immediately learn there's no product recall. Yes, this is the medicine which was destined for me, and it's safe to take it. So it's really fascinating stuff in terms of e-medicine and how the cloud is supporting that. So what's interesting here is that as we move on to the next wave, moving beyond traditional software as a service, infrastructure as a service, into much more sophisticated cloud applications like e-medicine, Ireland is at the forefront here. It's not just a case of the World Economic Forum saying certain countries like Japan and Korea are leading. I mean, there's some very exciting applications coming out of Ireland and which are using cloud technologies.